Welcome to READ, the Research, Education, and Advocacy podcast. READ connects you with prominent researchers, thought leaders, and educators on topics in education and child development. READ is produced by the Windward Institute. I'm your host, Dr. Danielle Gomez, and I'm so excited to speak with my guest today, Dr. Ola Ozernov-Palchik. I would like to know where you are in the world and how you're showing up into this conversation.
I'm in Brookline, Massachusetts. I have a pretty chill morning of getting the kids ready for school and getting ready for the podcast and chatting. So, yeah.
That's exciting. I saw that you were drinking something this morning. Is this tea? Is this coffee?
It's coffee. This is the time of the day, like I balance out my water with the coffee and then later on I'm transitioning into tea. So, yeah.
Yep. I actually like recording in the morning because I can feel the coffee. At least I picture, maybe it's like not actually happening in my body, but I picture like the coffee spreading throughout my bloodstream and getting me going. So, but I'm the same way. Well, I'm so excited for you to be on READ. And I know that every READ listener knows about your research. I mean, you have done so much work in the neurocognitive mechanisms of reading and language comprehension. You're such an advocate for early screening and interventions. And what I like most about your work is how collaborative you are and how pioneering you are in translating this research to benefit all stakeholders. So from your words, I'd like to know more about your story and your journey and your professional background.
Sure. So when I was an undergrad in psychology, I was kind of looking for research experience, and I very luckily landed into an Institute for Reading Research at Southern Methodist University. And so I was kind of like indoctrinated into this really very good research into reading. So I was working with Patricia Mathis, and later on, David Charr joined SMU and Reed Lyon. And so I got an opportunity to really like learn about what are like very rigorous research practices are without really being kind of like, I wasn't specifically interested in educational research. I just needed to get research experience. But slowly through this experience, I got really drawn into the work. And I was there for about 8 years developing assessment methods like iStation, going into schools and validating reading curriculum and interventions. And that's kind of what got me really interested in understanding what are the neurocognitive mechanisms that kind of underlying this variation in how children are responding to our instructions. So, you would kind of go and do like progress monitoring, and one child is they can see their curve kind of going up and they're, getting better and better with every time. And then other children really are struggling. And so I took a neuroscience course in a local university. This is what I was already graduated and had my very useful, undergraduate in psychology and philosophy. As we all know, it's a very useful undergraduate to have. And so, so I got interested, and I took a neuroscience course, and my mind was blown. And I was lucky to get a research assistant opportunity with Nadine Gabb at Boston Children's Hospital. This was my kind of entry point into the cognitive neuroscience research, and then I got my PhD in cognitive science, and the rest is history, from professional perspective. But yeah, and what was really nice about starting to work in Nadine's lab is that she just got a grant together with John Gabrielli to look at those early precursors of developmental dyslexia in kindergarten. So it was one of the kind of the first studies that marries the experiences I had of just going into schools and doing like really, on the ground educational research with cognitive neuroscience. So I'm happy to tell more about that research study, but I felt like, okay, I'm at home, but then I'm learning about, the neuroscience piece as well. So,
Yeah, that's interesting. So you started more in the behavioral research and then transition in neuroscience. What did that open up for you? Was there something that specifically you wanted to know more about the structure and the functions of the brain? I'm just curious how you transitioned from behavioral to neuroscience research.
So what it opened up for me is, and then I know, what kind of one of the things we're going to talk about is like, what can neuroscience contribute to this, what we already know in education? And in some ways, kind of that was my own journey from doing really rigorous, educational research. But I think for me, I was always interested in kind of the human mind. So that's why I went psychology and philosophy. I was trying to understand things that are behind human behavior, right? So, the measures we have in education and psychology can only tell us how a child is behaving, how are they responding, during an assessment in the classroom. But I was trying to understand, why are they responding this way? What is, because these measures can capture the why, right? And so the why is what I think neuroscience affords us.
Mhm.
And that's why I was really, really interested in kind of understanding that. And not just neuroscience, also, doing some of the experiments we're doing just generally in cognitive science, like experimental psychology, is also trying to kind of address the why in the behavior, right? By modulating different aspects of behavior through experimental design, also could answer the why question. So it doesn't necessarily has to be a neuroscience method. And so that's like really what kind of drew me to these methods in cognitive science.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. So I guess Windward well, and one of the things for me as a teacher coming out of the classroom into the Windward Institute role was when we partnered with the Haskins Global Literacy Hub, Dr. Landy's lab at Yale and UConn, in conducting an in-school neuroscience study. Because you're right, like you start to see these. I was seeing all of these behaviors happening in the classroom, and it was agency promoting, you know, in many ways because of all the professional development that we receive at Windward, the fidelity of program and implementation. And then when I then saw our students being tested over a number of years and seeing that change, it was just even more validating. Like I went home and I told my family that I was a brain like changer, like that I actually changed brains. And partly it was our old head of school, Dr. Jay Russell, when we were talking about that was his thing. He's like, we are change makers. And it was such an amazing new identity that I was adopting, right? And seeing how evidence-based methods in reading, and particularly for students who struggle, how that really can change behaviorally and structurally in the brain. So I echo a lot of the sentiments that you shared. One of the earlier studies that I read back in 2016 was the paper that you co-authored with Dr. Nadine Gabb, and it was called Tackling the Dyslexia Paradox, Reading Brain and Behavior for Early Markers of Developmental Dyslexia. And I have to say, it was a paper that I continue to turn to, like over and over again. I'm sure that your what was the markers? The markers of citations and all of the pieces that you measure how popular this article is, like, is probably really high, because I know I'm not alone. I know many of my colleagues and people in the reading broader educational community read this paper. And so I'd like to highlight this first. And so I thought it was interesting in the paper that you call it tackling the dyslexia paradox. So what is the tension or the paradox that exists in dyslexia?
So the paradox that exists in dyslexia is that we know that a child starts, the first day of kindergarten and already having some of the risk factors for dyslexia present. We know that, if they think about their brains, they already have a lot of sort of the structural and functional correlates of dyslexia already there. We also know that that's when the interventions are most effective. And this is from extensive meta-analysis done by across different labs, but Sharon Vaughn has published a lot on that. So we know that the effect sizes for interventions are most effective in those early grades, but we tend to wait until second or third grade when we know that sort of the symptom of dyslexia, which is a failure to learn how to read, is present, to identify children. And it takes, even after they identified as having dyslexia, it takes a while for them to start getting the help they need. And so this is what we call a paradox, where, interventions are very effective earlier on, but we're not diagnosing until way later. And of course, we know that there's a range of kind of social emotional consequences of having, those struggles of learning to read in the classroom day in and day out for a child. We also, again, know that dyslexia could be persistent if they're not getting the help they need, again, if they don't get the help they need early on. And so, so we wrote this paper, particularly because we're like, well, we look around in our labs and other labs, and we see that the neural markers are already there. There's actually some studies done in infants, a few hours after birth that have familiar risk for dyslexia. They're already showing that their brains are not processing speech sounds in the same way as their counterparts who don't have that familial risk for dyslexia. And so there was already at this point quite a bit of evidence. But then when you go to schools, they basically say to children or to the families, like, let's just wait. They'll grow out of it. They'll catch up. Let's just wait. And so we kind of saw that as this paradox that exists between what we know for science and what we know that is most effective and what is actually happening in practice.
It must be, I don't know how I insert myself in how you feel about it, but I don't know. If I was in your shoes, I would feel incredibly frustrated knowing about this, right? Like, and as an educator, an advocate, right? Like seeing the costs or seeing the benefits to early intervention and identification and knowing that there is a path forward, and then understanding how our system is set up, like, and all the costs that actually exist, like and I think your paper does an incredible job in synthesizing those costs, from social emotional costs to incidents of in the juvenile justice system. And I know I've seen Famiko Haft has in some of her presentations has even outlined some of the economic costs that other organizations have done. And you're right, like the paradox is there, and it's incredibly frustrating. And so, do you feel that way?
Yes, I mean, I don't want to make it a support group kind of thing, but yes, I think I do. And this is what kind of compelled me into being more active in the advocacy sector rather than just
Yeah.
kind of staying in my lane and like, I'm a researcher, just going to do, the best research that I can, is going out there and, being vocal about this. But there's a lot of things that frustrates me, and kind of like how research propagates into practice, and vice versa as well. Of course, it's a bidirectional kind of relationship. But yeah, it definitely feels frustrating, and even and sort of like what I also feel, it's like we can never quite reach the sort of the gold standard in some ways. Like I feel like,
Yeah.
okay, now we're screening, but then like how are we doing this? That's the question. And like what is really coming out is that even though the screeners are there, the way we screen actually may be counterproductive to identifying children at risk for dyslexia, right? And then like if we are already being screened, like which percentage of these children are going to get the intervention that they need, and how effective is this intervention. So it's like, I feel like there's so much there, and we just have to kind of keep going, right? And this is in part why I teach the course that I teach, is kind of to develop new cohorts and generations of people to advocate for, who can first of all understand the evidence, but then can also advocate for the translation of this evidence into practice.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I want to dive into advocacy and then the translation and the structural mechanisms that should and are starting to exist, but we still need to have a way to go. I'm curious about your research in neuroimaging, and truthfully, like your transdisciplinary research, all the methods that you use to understand the underlying brain structures. And there's such an incredible value to understanding the evidence as an educator, as a parent, as a policymaker. And so can you share more about that, the methods that you use and how you use those methods to then conclude that there's an evidence base that exists related to reading development?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, I could start by kind of describing that study that launched my neuroscience career, which was it's the READ study. It's researching early attributes of dyslexia. And so in this study, we basically kind of went into schools the first few months of kindergarten. And the goal was like, can we really identify predictors of dyslexia from early months of kindergarten into second grade or third grade, which is when children are being already diagnosed with dyslexia. And so we went into 21 schools in New England, and Nadine and I used to joke that we are kind of like, like travel salespeople, because we would really, to get to 21 schools, we had to do a lot of recruitment and go into with a lot of principals and a lot of superintendents. Really, we were on the road, and at some point we were also both pregnant on the road, so it was quite a circus show. We would like show up with our big bellies and enter the office and try to kind of explain why this study is important, right? Because you're coming in trying to sell a neuroscience study, right, to a principal in the school and say, like, we're going to come in and we're going to screen all of your kindergartners with the measures we know are very predictive of dyslexia outcomes, right, or like predictors of risk. And many principals said, no, thank you, because if
Oh,
MIT comes and Harvard, Children's Hospital come and say to me that 20% of the children in my school are at risk, what am I going to do with this information? I don't have the infrastructure. I don't have the systematic kind of problem solving pipeline of like, okay, what I'm going to do with these students, right? And so anyway, so we were able to recruit 21 schools, and we screened over, I think it was like 1,600 children over 3 years.
wow.
With the short battery assessment for logical awareness, letter sound knowledge, RAN, your language measure, your nonverbal IQ short measure, and we just and then based on that, on the screener, we identified children as being at risk versus no risk, and we tried to invite more children who are at risk because we wanted to have a large enough sample of children with dyslexia a few years later. And so out of this group, we invited about 180 children to come into MIT. And there we did like a more extensive assessment, but we also did neuroimaging. So we did EEG with them. So we tried to do some of those same experiments that some labs did with, the infants, where children would kind of sit in this EEG booth and they would listen to speech sounds like ba, 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 da, ba, ba, ba. And what the studies in infants showed is that when the da comes in, the children who are at risk for dyslexia, infants who are at risk for dyslexia, their brains are not responding as robustly to that deviation in speech sounds. And so we tried to replicate that. And then we also had children come into our brain camera, which is our MRI scanner. And we collected some information of the children while they were doing structural information. Structural brain information is basically like a picture of your elbow. It's kind of the same, like it's a structural image. And then functional so their functional brain responses to phonological awareness. So they did like a rhyming task in the scanner and orthographic tasks. So they looked at letters versus faces versus squiggles on the screen. And then we followed those kiddos until the end of the summer before third grade. So we followed them for 3 years. Until we kind of were able to do, already identify which children actually have dyslexia. And we had the whole 180 children come back. So that was pretty amazing. It was a pretty positive experience for them. You would think, right? Like kindergartners in the scanner, you wouldn't think they'd be like, yes, we want to do it again, but they didn't. We worked really hard.
180?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh
and
my gosh.
Elizabeth Norton, who's now at Northwestern, was like she was a postdoc at that time. And so she was really amazing and kind of setting up the protocol to making sure that everyone is coming back. And so, so we collected a lot of data. And basically what we were able to find is that, there's already some functional and structural correlates that we see. So if you look at the brain of someone with dyslexia, we see that there's some differences in their brains during a phonological task, or just structural differences in the brain regions we know important for reading. And the question that we asked was like, well, is that like a cause or consequence of dyslexia? Because we know that brains are incredibly plastic. Mm-hmm. We know that reading is not like a system we're born with. In fact, the reading brain kind of develops as a result of the experience of learning to read. So what we do is we kind of like, integrate the visual system into the language system through the process of learning to read. We kind of like, bring it together. And so the question was like, are the atypicalities we see just because somebody who has dyslexia is not just reading as much? And so that plasticity, right? So the brain system is just not created to the same extent as in somebody who is a prolific reader. And so it's kind of chicken and egg question. And so, and what we found is that we already see in pre-reading children some of those same differences in their brains within the first 3 months of kindergarten, during a phonological task, during orthographic task, also some structural measures, which suggests to us that those differences predate dyslexia and could potentially be causal to dyslexia rather than be sort of a consequence of just reading less. So that was like one of the studies we did. But we're continuing to look in research, and I'm very interested in how, for example, reading comprehension unfolds in the brains of children with and without dyslexia, with the idea that, although we know that, word level processes are really important for reading comprehension, there's a range of other processes that are also important. And so what are they doing, right? So sometimes we have children who have poor word reading, but actually able to, do pretty well in reading comprehension. Is it that they're relying more on their content knowledge during, the comprehension? Is it that they have stronger cognitive systems that are coming into place? So trying to understand those processes, which again, when we look at the behavior, we just know that we have one child with poor word reading and good reading comprehension, another child who has good word reading and good reading, right? We can't really differentiate the profiles. Just looking at their behavior. So
Yeah. Oh, I love that. It's really interesting. And I marked down causal versus consequence, the chicken versus the egg, because I think that's such an important, I don't want to say nuance, but just an important element, right, of this research, that you're seeing this in children that are in the pre-reading phases. And I think that when you say causal, I'm afraid to use a deficit language of like less efficient. But do you know where I'm going with this? Like in terms of students with dyslexia, their brains are structured differently. So it makes it more difficult for them to learn to read.
Yeah, so we see the differences in a phonological system. And again, yes, we call it differences because the thing that's important to emphasize is like before the invention of reading, that could not be a deficit, right? It could actually maybe be a strength, right? And if we were to invent something that's not reading, it would have been that difference could have been translating into behavior. It could be in some ways advantageous. And so that's why we like to, we say difference is not a deficit in the brain. But the differences are in the phonological system. So something about how they process sounds. And so what we think is that something has to do with, the early brain development, right? So we know that dyslexia is very hereditary. So like if you have a first degree relative dyslexia, you're 40 to 60% likely to have dyslexia yourself. And so having some sort of like that genetic risk translates into some differences in how the brain is structured that then affects the development of your phonological system early on. It's interesting that despite decades and decades of research, we don't really understand, for example, like the origin of those phonological deficits. There's a range of theories, like is it a basic auditory, which is some of my research as well, is like is it a basic auditory deficit? Is it a deficit in this implicit system, like the system that, the cognitive system that underlies like learning things, like riding a bike, right, where we're not without kind of conscious awareness to things. So is it like a general deficit in implicit learning? It's been suggested. Is it if it's an auditory deficit, is it specifically with processing really rapid auditory tones or rather some other acoustic cues? So there's a lot of kind of like fine grain analysis of where this phonological deficit originates from. But we know that it's something that characterizes many individuals with dyslexia. And we also see it on the kind of the brain level as well. So,
yeah, I really appreciate you outlining this and synthesizing this. And it, from an educator perspective and from a family member of people with dyslexia, two things I think that really stick out to me is the genetic component, right? So if a parent, right, you said has dyslexia, it's a 40-60% chance that a child will have dyslexia. And I think that starting from that is incredibly important. And that information is incredibly empowering. Would you say if a parent has a reading difficulty, any type of reading difficulty, that there's a high likelihood, or is it just dyslexia?
So if you think about reading as this, and I know you had Sarah Hart on this podcast, and she's very this is all of her research, but dyslexia is a continuously distributed skill. So we know overall there's a really huge genetic component in terms of, if you're a good reader, then you're more likely to have, a child has a good reader. So a lot of those skills and abilities are, have a huge genetic component. And so that's what I would say. Like we know, so in terms of like genetic composition, dyslexia, we know it's not associated with just one gene, rather it's like a polygenetic kind of risk composite. So there are multiple genes that come into play and interact in some ways to predispose someone to be at risk for dyslexia, rather than just like if you have this gene and you have dyslexia or not. But yes, in general, like reading is overall is hereditary, and so is just oral language, and so is math and many other things. But of course, there's also an environmental experiential component that comes into place.
Yeah, and I thank you for explaining that even further, because in the point I'm making too is when you have family lines, right, and you have maybe certain physical features, all these other features and way that we express ourselves as humans, right, that this is one component of perhaps a difference that could exist across family lines. And I think that's in itself empowering, because when I think of something, in my family, for example, we have a child in the family that does have dyslexia, and her father never was diagnosed with dyslexia, but had said, oh, yeah, that makes sense. I had a reading difficulty growing up, and I still have a reading difficulty. And he's incredibly successful, but there are things that he's put into a place, for himself to navigate the world around him. And I know that we're not alone in a family in that way. There's countless people that I speak to that say, yes, like this is my lived experience. And so in connecting the science with the story and lived experience, I think that's a really critical piece to highlight. The other piece from an educator's perspective that I'm really happy you touched upon was these learner differences, right? That differences exist prior to formal education. And so as educators, we need to make sure that we are creating environments for students so that that we could address those differences, that we could leverage the strengths and all the needs that they do have. And the good news is, in reading education, we have the knowledge and the methods to already do that. And so that brings me to the next part of this conversation. That's the advocacy piece, right? That we have the knowledge. How do we then ensure that people then can gain that knowledge too and translate that to better environments, cultures, supports, practices for students, policies, for example? So I know that you've been active locally, statewide, nationally. I mean, you name it, at some level you've been in, whether it's writing or making partnerships or connecting with policymakers. You've been really active in advocacy. So I'd like to know a little bit more about your areas that you have advocated for, and how that's really been informed by your research work.
Sure. So I would say the main area was universal screening practices
Mhm.
for literacy. And this is something that, very early in my career when I was a PhD student, again, doing the research we were doing with Nadine and John and kind of getting those insights, really emphasized it for us. Like, we need to have this screening, universal, every single child going, entering the kindergarten should be really screened for that risk for reading difficulties. And it wasn't really there in schools. And many, as I mentioned, like many schools were like, no, thank you. We don't want to do this. We don't have the resources. We don't have the knowledge. We don't have the training, right? We can't accommodate that. And so early on, I was lucky to meet Nancy Duggan, who was leading the Decoding Dyslexia in a parent grassroots organization in Massachusetts. And she is really the kind of like a force of knowing how to translate our work. She really taught us how to translate our research into advocacy, right? She would you need to pull up this picture of the brain in kindergarten and see the differences are there the first days of kindergarten. Like, why are we waiting for 3 or 4 years to identify a child as risk, right? And so that kind of we went to Washington, D.C. We spoke to congressional staff. We advocated for both kind of on a national for universal screening, but also I got involved in my local district here in Brookline, which was also not doing, screening for a while. And I got involved sort of again, through personal experience of having a family member go through the school system. And really, it was in some ways paradoxical, because here I had, a very close family member going through the schools and literally told, like, we'll wait. He was an English language learner. So they immigrated when he started first grade. And then in the same time, I was kind of advocating for let's not wait. And then until I realized, okay, at this point for him, it's not, and I'm sure you see that a lot, it's not an English language issue, it's a dyslexia issue. So instead of taking him out for getting English instruction, he should be learning how to read, right? And getting intensive reading instruction. And so I got involved in the kind of the local on the district level, and also started learning about the structure. Like, for example, it was very surprising to me, which I didn't know. I'm not originally from US, that everything is happening on a local level. That each district sort of chooses their own adventure in some ways, right? And so even though we know like this is what works in education, this is what for reading, every district kind of reinvents the wheel in some ways, saying like, oh, let's see what we want to do. And often the people who make that decision, like school committee members they don't make the decision, but they kind of like, give the platform for this decision to be made, don't have the training or the experience needed to synthesize this research, right? And so how those decisions are made in terms of how to teach our children how to read was kind of really eye-opening for me. And so we founded with Miriam Fine and Ben Kelly, some local parents. Miriam is actually speech and a literacy specialist with a lot of years of experience. And we founded the Brooklyn Literacy Coalition. And we just started going to like school committee meetings and, and writing newsletters, kind of summarizing the process and what's happening, kind of synthesizing what's happening in those school committee meetings. What are the conversations focused about and what we think about this, right? We, had meetings set up with the district leaders and tried to advocate for evidence-based, like what screeners should we choose and what should we do following the screeners? And so that's kind of like both. So those are some of the efforts we were doing, but I'm really not like, I was really never, I think I was just learning through the process because I really had no idea what like the local system of governance looks like and how that affects what our children are actually doing in schools, for example. Yeah.
Were there any, so in this work, a lot of what you're talking about resonates with me in the sense of as you start in like one area, right? So for you, it was in the lab and research. For me, it was in the classroom. And then you start to build out and start to see, what's happening here in other schools or what's happening in policy, what's happening at the system level. And I had to start to learn maybe the different, I don't want to say languages, but try to figure out how to operate. One of my advisors from Hopkins, Carrie Burkowski, calls it like this third space, right? Like where, I'm not a researcher, but I've learned to speak language of research and learn from and ask the right questions. I think that's really the piece of it. I work at a certain school at Windward School, but if I'm talking to a district leader or a school leader, what is their experience? And I've had to learn to sort of connect the dots in those ways and think much, beyond myself. And so I'm curious, from you starting in research to advocacy to working with schools, were there any skill sets or behaviors that you had to adopt in order to be more successful in igniting change?
Oh, for sure. I mean, just the language we use, for example, I had to really adjust the language I used to present my findings. So I've done a lot of I've done a lot of presentations in front of parents and teachers. And like one of the things we talk about is the deficit language, right? It's something that I learned to say, like that it's a difference, right?
Right.
There's some things that we used to say, like, I still remember I have this slide or like dyslexia is persistent. So if you have dyslexia at the end of second grade, you're going to have dyslexia by the end of high school. And I realized I'm talking to parents who are sitting in front of me and that's not what they want to hear about their child, right? Like child's going to have dyslexia. And my point was like when I talk to, if I want to make a point to like legislation, right, is that without systematic, explicit, effective instruction, the children are going to like fall behind. That was my point for this audience. But for this audience, I don't want to tell parents that their child is going to have dyslexia for the rest of their life. I mean, having reading difficulties for the rest of their lives. Like, I want to, I want them to understand that, like, those are the levers we need to push in order for the child to have typical reading skills, and they could have good reading skills, right? And so, I think like switching the language, for a while, like there's like say dyslexia, right? And there was like a whole say dyslexia initiative. Like, can you even say dyslexia? Should we just say literacy or like reading differences or whatever it is? Like, what language do you use? So I think learning kind of like where you draw the balance of like you don't want to shut down your conversation partner immediately, like if it's a school administration, for example, not to say that things are going to be immediately like, okay, we don't want to talk to you anymore, but then still be like, I'm not going to compromise what I know, right? In terms of like what works best. And if I want to use the word dyslexia because it's an important term to use, I'm still going to use it. It's really finding that line is hard. And I'm not like the most diplomatic person. Like I'm not a politician. I'm like very much like, this is what, and so learning how to navigate that was hard. And this is why having a lot of people who know that space, like Nancy, I mean, she's like a fish swimming in those waters at this point, and she can guide you in this process, right? And so knowing kind of like, and be humble enough to, okay, I'm going to just shut up and let Nancy talk about, maybe my findings, because she might know how to present it better to this particular audience, right? So having community partners is incredibly important. Really having like a very well-rounded team of collaborators who kind of learn from you and you learn from them to guide you in this conversation. I think it's really important.
Yeah, I love that. The networking and the community partnerships, I think, is really important, because even if you're at a table, right, and you're both trying to get to the same goal, you have obviously a set of expertise. The person next to you, like Nancy, has a certain expertise, and you might be saying the same thing, but it's a different way. And maybe it hits that person that or maybe they just, you have a different way of asking questions, or, based on your expertise and your lived experience, right? Like that really can get, move that needle forward. I'm curious, what have been some bright spots that you have celebrated over the last few years in your advocacy efforts and translating your research?
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that like universal screening is widely implemented right now. So it's been huge, right?
Yeah.
Again, for those of us advocating for that, it's like, it's happening. Children are being screened using, standardized measures. So the data is being collected. I would say I'm maybe, because even as I'm describing it, I want to say, but, right, immediately the but like, let's pause and celebrate that. But I feel like there's still so much work. I mean, we're still like, as a nation, far from being there in terms of reading proficiency. And so, I think I think there's kind of acknowledgement now more than before about the importance of evidence-based instruction. I think like Emily Hanford's podcast told the stories, did a huge service in that kind of direction, right? Of like, people are talking about the science of reading now. Universal screening is being implemented in most states in the United States. So I think it's a huge progress forward, but of course, there's a lot of work still to be done. And
Yeah. So what are those challenges that you see that we need to continue to address?
Yeah, so I'm like, as we speak, we're writing up a paper where we conducted a survey of educators administering universal screenings in schools. So just like a random sampling, and we asked them a bunch of questions like about what, how much training did you receive? What is your knowledge? How did you feel prepared administering the screener? Like, things like that, just trying to understand kind of some of the implementational factors around universal screening, which is really interesting because there's a lot of research on kind of like the fidelity of implementation of interventions, but
Right.
not much about assessments. And if we don't really identify children correctly, like how do we know which children need to be receiving interventions? And my perspective, and again, I may be a bit pessimistic on that, but like my perspective is that a lot of this data being collected through the universal screening is kind of like filed away in some ways. And so that pipeline between like, let's screen all children and actually give them the help they need is not there, not quite there yet. But that's my own perspective. Again, it might be fully anecdotal because I'm unlike you. I'm not in schools anymore. I haven't been in schools for a while, just through advocacy and conversations we've been having with people. But the picture that's emerging is that there's a lot of variability, right? And how the screeners are administered and how much training practitioners receive and how prepared they are to administer the screener with great fidelity, before they see their first child, with understanding, for example, how to score answers based on like English language learnings, if a child is English language learner and make a mistake versus whether it's actual like a mistake on the screener. And so things like that. And so, So yeah, really understanding those implementational factors, like how it's actually happening in the schools, and what is being used, like how is this data being used? Can this data be interpreted in a way that supports decision-based instruction, things like that.
Yeah, that's interesting. You talked about with English language learners. I doing research a number of years ago. I don't know how many years ago it was, but the DESI, I can't remember what it stands for, but the Massachusetts Policy on Early Screening, was extremely helpful in kind of attending to some of the nuances, maybe of screening and how you look at the whole picture of a child, right? So for students who are English language learners in the American system, right, that they'd spoken another language and they're learning English and they're being screened, to what extent would you say that some of the screening tools are becoming better to identify whether it's an actual reading difficulty versus a consequence of just learning another language?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if the screening tools currently being used do a good job in differentiating that. I mean, if they collect some oral language measures, that could be one kind of data point that could be used. But
Mhm.
so actually, some of our work at MIT and in collaboration with Florida State University, Ozernov-Palchik, is trying to develop better tools using kind of the speech data that we collect to differentiate English language learner mistakes versus, or like errors, for example, on a non-word repetition measure, right?
Mhm.
Is it because of, is a pronunciation issue? Is the mistake because of in their English language learners or some sort of speech production error? Or is it an actual mistake just because they have a phonological deficit, right? So basically the idea is like, can we use artificial intelligence to help us pick out on the subtle differences in child speech, and to allow us to differentiate children and differentiate errors based on English language learning status versus again like an actual phonological deficit. And so because child speech is something that's like really collected, every single screener we use relies on child speech. And so if we have those algorithms can automatically enable scoring. So not necessarily the screener itself necessarily going to be different, but the way we score the child speech production is going to be in some ways different and more advanced. We could potentially kind of advance that accuracy and precision and identifying risk. And so so we have several projects underway kind of doing that and trying to advance that aspect of screening forward.
Yeah, I would imagine too that would be such a important way forward for equity, right? And understanding maybe nuances, variability in speech patterns of students, whether it's different types of American English variability or just a different language as an English learner. I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I would say in our survey we had about, and I'm kind of like a flash news from, we haven't published a paper yet, but we had about 50-50 responses in terms of understanding the difference between English language learners versus an actual like mistake due to, literacy risk, which is huge.
Yeah.
Huge implications for equity and like how children, and we know that children with like who are English language learners tend to be under-identified in the school districts, right?
Yeah.
Or in just having like any language variations. So has huge implications for sure.
Yeah.
Intervention.
I have two other questions for you. So, looking ahead, what excites you the most about the future of reading science or areas of research? We talked a lot about some of that work of early screening and identification to your work on reading comprehension. So, can you share some of those pieces that you're excited to address in reading science?
Yeah. So like I said, some of my kind of current and future work is going to be focusing on understanding individual differences, again, in reading comprehension among children who are typical readers or children with dyslexia. Where we are with neuroimaging is that we're developing like increasingly more precise methods of kind of differentiating individual brains rather than kind of looking at brains on average. So comparing like children with or without something, right? But really looking within the group with greater precision. And so using some of those more precise tools to try to understand, for example, like, for me, what I'm interested in is like, what are the different systems that come into play to support someone's reading comprehension,
Right.
and how those systems are different in differentiating children who are able to, again, develop, despite having dyslexia or poor word reading level, skills, are able to develop typical comprehension versus a child who's not. And so specifically, I'm really interested in kind of the role of knowledge and how, content knowledge and background knowledge, what role it plays in supporting children's comprehension. And then on the other side of it, I really think that kind of the advancements in artificial intelligence have a huge potential for some of this scalability issue we have in education. So what I see kind of as, sort of the biggest gap between what we know that works and actually like making scalable or like at large improvements in reading performance at scale is this issue of scalability, right? I keep using that word, and so for example, we know that targeted intervention that's data driven, right? It's like individualized is most effective for children who are at the greatest risk, but it's really hard to do at scale, right? And again, we know that it's like screening, right? One of the difficulties we talked about in terms of identifying children effectively at risk and precisely is this idea of scoring, for example, how to score. And so AI could really advance those different domains. So again, if you're doing automatic scoring, then educators don't need to spend time scoring the assessment. It potentially could be more precise, right? And so taking the child's performance and translating into a risk profile, for example, is something that can likely, very soon can be done automatically. And similarly, in providing this individualized adaptive instruction, again, I'm not saying that AI is going to replace teachers, but they can definitely, I think, fill in some gaps where the teacher may not have the time, for example, to provide this individualized instructions. It could have some sort of like tutoring system, for example, that can work on a particular component of the child's learning while collecting multidimensional data on child's learning and providing the data back to the teacher so they can continue using the data kind of to support the child in the classroom. So kind of looking forward, I think that artificial intelligence I know that there's also a lot of concerns about it, but I do think there's a lot of huge area of promise in terms of really kind of bridging that scalability gap that we see.
Yeah, I think I echo a lot of your similar thoughts too, of seeing the potential of scalability. And what I appreciate most are researchers like you, like Dr. Yakov-Petcher. I was talking to Dr. Devin Kearns about utilizing some computer models and AI, and it's the intentionality of it, right? Of understanding like, okay, it's not going to replace or deliver something that maybe we can't promise, but at least in achieving some of that scalability and understanding data, like these are, I think, pockets where potentially it has some incredible opportunities to it. And I just wanted to return back to what you talked about, reading comprehension. And it's one that we talk a lot about on Read, as you know, and I'm really happy that you talked about it a little bit throughout the podcast, but understanding more about the multidimensionality of reading comprehension, including some of those areas, like you said, content knowledge. You mentioned earlier about dyslexia and I think reading difficulties at large, not being, one discrete difficulty, right? But a continuum, or more of just understanding that it is multidimensional, and how do we then develop those screening measures, those interventions, those educational practices to attend to that. And I think that's really important. So I'm happy you talked about that. My last question is really from the lens of an educator. I know that you teach and you formerly directed the Mind, Brain, and Education Master's Program at Harvard's Graduate School of Education. And so what do you say to educators listening, or families listening, or even your fellow researchers that are hoping to communicate this, the benefits of the science of brain development and what we can do walking away from this episode to make sure that findings from brain development really reach our schools and homes and communities?
I think that science of brain development provides kind of complementary evidence for things that we already knew potentially from from just doing educational research. So I don't believe that it's like, because I'm asked this question a lot, so I'm trying to be really thoughtful about it.
Yeah.
So again, for example, like we know from educational research that early interventions are important. We know from brain research that brains are most plastic early in development. So it's a complementary evidence, right? To give you to provide sort of the biological perspective on something that we know from behavioral science. Yeah. And so I think, just like we try to understand the causes of many things, right, in our bodies. So we know that, we have a sort of a behavioral diabetes, right? We try to understand what is the cause of this diabetes. It's similar with education. Like the brain is sort of like the ultimate, I like to tell my students, like the ultimate mediator of behavior, right? Like it is the link between like something, a risk and an outcome, right? There's a brain in the middle, right? It mediates everything that we do. It explains everything that we do in some ways. And so trying to understand kind of the explanation behind things could empower both educators, like you said, right? Like, we're changing brains, right? It could empower students to understand, like, I'm not just lazy. I'm not just like not motivated, right? There's a difference in my brain that kind of like, that's why it's so hard for me to learn to read. Like, it's not something, and then I think it's wrong with me. I'm just like, I'm not like not trying hard enough. It's just, there's a biological difference in my brain.
Yeah.
But again, it could be an advantage in some perspectives, but it is, in this case, it is something that makes it hard for me to learn how to read. And so I think it could empower people, but also, again, by providing kind of a more objective measure of like, the child already has those differences in the first few months of kindergarten, underlies the importance and the significance of like, providing the appropriate tools that the child needs in order to succeed.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, that's that. I love that. I'm so happy that you ended with that. For those of you that are listening, rewind that and really take that with you as advocates in reading science and in education. Dr. Ozernov-Palchik, thank you for being on the Read podcast. This has been a long time coming. I'm such a fan. And thank you so much for offering your time today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Read podcast with Dr. Ozernov-Palchik, all about reading science and the brain and education and advocacy. And so I hope you gained as much as I did from this episode. To learn more about Read or our guests, you can visit the Read podcast webpage on the Windward Institute's website, thewindwardschool.org/WI, where you'll find all of our media resources. I also invite you to continue to engage with us, both on our website, our newsletters, our social media platforms, including Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. We just want to continue the conversation. And I also invite you to check out all of our future offerings this spring, from our workshops to our annual lecture with Dr. Jeannie Wanzik. You can sign up directly on the Windward Institute's webpage. If you're in the New York tri-state area, we will be hosting Dr. Wanzik live at our Westchester campus in White Plains. And you can also check out her lecture on Zoom as well. So all of the things, you can stay connected with us. If you have any ideas of topics and speakers, feel free to reach out to me at info@readpodcast.org. And that is it. A lot of learning today. I have to finish the rest of my coffee. So with that, Dr. Ozernov-Palchik, will you say our final send-off until next time, readers?
Until next time, readers.
Thank you so much. Yay!